Hi, in this short video, I'm going to explain you the BABOK book structure and how to basically use this video to memorize and remember the BABOK content for your exam interviews and also to strengthen your understanding. Let me start with the concept of BABOK. BABOK is a business analysis body of knowledge, and this is version number 3. That's the latest version, and this book is offered by IIBA. That's the International Institute of Business Analysis. Let me take you to the table of content now. Okay, here is a table of content and the page first, and you can see here the chapter number 1. It talks about the introduction, and within the introduction there are 4 sections. That is the section 1.1 describes the purpose of a BABOK guide, and section 1.2 describes the what is business analysis and the definition of business analysis, and section 1.3 describes who is the business analyst and what are the different the designations the business analyst may have. And in chapter 1.4 it talks about the structure of BABOK guide. This particular video is little different from what it is explained here. I'm going to go through that actually. In chapter 2, it is like a business analysis key concept and other the concepts are there which will be used in this book. In this 2.1 emphasized on newly introduced the business analysis core concept model. This will talk about the 6 elements and how they are basically relevant to the business analysis. And 2.2 basically emphasizes on the business analysis key terms, and 2.3 talks about the different types of requirement and how they are classified. That's a requirement classification schema. And 2.4 it talks about the stakeholders and different types of stakeholders and their role and the definition. And 2.5 talks about the requirements and the design. What are the different types of requirement and different types of designs with an examples. From the chapter 3 onwards, we will be basically learning the key knowledge areas, that is a core part of the BABOK book. The chapter 1 and 2 basically emphasized more on building the foundation, and 3 talks about business analysis planning and monitoring, what kind of a planning a business analyst must do before he starts the project. And in the, if you see here in the sections 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, 3.5 and so on, those are basically are the task, the task which business analysts need to complete in order to complete his planning and monitoring phase. So in these are the how the knowledge areas are structured. One is the chapter name, it that itself is basically you can consider them as a knowledge area, or the activity within that you can see the list of the tasks which we need to complete. And then we have chapter 4, that is elicitation and collaboration. That's basically a next task which we need to complete, and within that the next activity, sorry, and within that we will see that there are 5 tasks listed. That's a preparing for elicitation, conducting elicitation, confirming the elicitation result, communicate the business analysis information, and manage the stakeholder collaboration. Right? And next basically chapter 5, that's in the next knowledge area, that is requirement lifecycle management. This basically emphasizes on the requirement which we have elicited and confirmed, how do we basically manage them throughout the project and after the project. So this is basically how do we trace the requirement, how do we retrieve them whenever we need them. So and how do we maintain the requirement, or we can say that maintaining itself is like saving the requirement for the project and beyond the project. Then how do we prioritize the requirement, how do we assess the requirement changes, so that's basically change request. And then we talk about the how the requirements are approved. So this is basically a process of basically managing the requirement throughout its life cycle. When we talk about the life cycle, it's a requirement life cycle, not the project or the software life cycle. Okay. So requirement life cycle will start with when you elicit the requirement, and it will basically end when you basically don't need that particular requirement and you just archive them, right? And the chapter 6 basically emphasize on the strategy analysis. That is, it talks about how do you analyze the current state and what are the parameters you need to basically consider. And 6.2, that is a task which talks about the how do you define the future state and the different elements you need to consider. And 6.3 talks about the assessing the risk and how do we identify them and assess those risks. And the next is a 6.4. The task is basically emphasizing on defining the change strategy. Okay, so the defining the change strategy here is basically how the change is implemented and which way you want to go. You may have various solution options, and do you want to build, or you want to basically buy off the shelf project, or how do we want to implement in one big bang process, or step by step, or the I mean to say phase wise. Okay. And next we talk about the chapter 7, that's requirement analysis, design definition. And once we decide the change strategy, and that's where the basically the development will be start. But before that, we want to ensure that the each and every requirements are uh, specified in a particular way, or predefined template, or a predefined structure. And those are also the requirement complemented with the model. The model could be process diagram, it could be your prototypes, or it could be use cases, or many other ways you can basically create the abstract version of the requirement, so that it helps basically to reduce the ambiguity, and also it is not subject to multiple interpretation. Then we talk about the task 2, it is when we need to verify the requirement. It means that whatever the requirements we have specified and modeled in the requirement document, that you may call it as a functional requirement document. So those each and every requirement we want to ensure that we verify them on certain parameters or checklist, and ensure that they are correct, complete, consistent and cohesive. Then we talks about the next task is validating the requirement. Validating requirement is basically nothing but we want to ensure that each and every requirement justifies its presence in the requirement document, or it is in line with the solution definitions or solution scope, and it also contribute to the solution and organization goal. Okay. Then we talk about the next task is defining the requirement structure. This is requirement architecture, is basically structuring your requirement. And next task we are talking about design options. You may have various design options, and how do you basically um, select them on various parameters. Then the last basically task under requirement analysis and design definition is analyze the potential value and recommend a solution. You may have multiple options um, um, in various approach you may select, and in that basically we need to analyze the solutions and benchmark them, and basically after benchmarking you can basically present your recommendation to the stakeholders, so they can make the right decisions about the selecting the solution. Okay. Then the next basically chapter we talk about the solution evaluation. This part is basically how do we evaluate the solution, emphasize. And then it in this, if you see the task 8.1, it is emphasizing on measuring the solution performance. So how do you measure the solutions, and what are the basically the parameters are there. And next task, it talks about analyze the performance measures. So after you analyze the solution performance, you may also see whether the performance measures are correct, or they do, you need to update them. And those performance measures could be your key performance area indicators, that is KPIs, and more. Next task we talk about is basically 8.3, that is assess the solution limitations. You may want to basically assess what are the different solution measures are there, and those measures, when we talk about the limitations, that will help us out to understand the capabilities, what solution can do and what it cannot do. Based on that analysis, we can see how we can basically improve the productivity of the solution. Okay. Now we talk about next is assess the enterprise limitations. In this case, when we talk about assessing the enterprise limitations, solution may offer many additional features or functionalities, but if the organization is not ready due to its technical or the process or the skill limitations, so we want to plan how we can basically improve the organizational capabilities to ensure that we make most of it. Okay. Then we talk about recommend actions to increase the solution value. How do we recommend, what are the actions we will basically recommend based on the solution limitations and enterprise limitations, and the analysis we have done, what are the what are the key factors can be implemented to improve the solution performance, and then how, based on that, how the solution can basically deliver more value to the organization. Okay, so this is what we talk about. These are the core key concept or knowledge areas, and other chapters, basically chapter number 9, it will talk about the underlying competencies required by a business analyst to perform the role as a business analyst. So these are equally important to understand what kind of the skill or knowledge you need in order to basically perform your role effectively. These are apart from the business analysis knowledge. So here there we emphasize on the business knowledge, that's a domain knowledge, communication skill, behavioral characteristics, and the interaction skills, and also the analytical thinking and problem solving. Apart from that, it also talks about the tools and technology a business analyst must know in order to perform his role effectively. Okay. And next chapter talks about the technique. If you see, there are 50 techniques listed here. Okay, yeah, 50 here. So these techniques basically explain you, each technique we explained in detail, so that you can select them or you can shortlist them in order to basically complete your task. So you may have, while selecting the technique, there are key point you need to remember is always select the technique first that you are comfortable with, and first they are appropriate for the particular task, then you select which are you are comfortable with, and those you can recommend with to your stakeholders, and let the stakeholder further select them. That way you will see you have selected the appropriate technique that is comfortable for you and the stakeholder, that will help you to basically complete your task effectively. Okay, and next chapter it talks about the perspectives. This is a new part in BABOK version number 3. If you see, this was not there in the previous version, and it talks about 5 different perspectives, that is from the agile perspective, the business intelligence, information technology, business architecture, and business process management perspective. So the business analysis, basically the knowledge will be implemented in a different way, in a different perspective. That's what basically it means. So now after this overview, I'm going to basically go back to the chapter number 3, that's first knowledge area, business analysis, planning and monitoring. Here we will take one example and we will create the structure. Based on that, you can basically create the structure for entire BABOK on your own. You can populate remaining data. Okay, so I'm going to basically go to the basic the Excel sheet. Here is the Excel sheet here. If you see, I have created the table of content here, and one is a BABOK guide and a chapter 1, 2, and within that all of them are listed here. Within that, if you see, there are the task or the sections, but I'm not taken other parts, the other chapters that we will consider later on. And if you see here, this is a chapter number 3. What I simply did is basically in the chapter 3, that is planning and monitoring, and in this it is a chapter 3.1. Let's basically give a different color so that we can understand this is okay. So in that, if you see, these are basically, let's group them. Okay, group. Okay, so this will help you to basically, if you want to hide them like that, so you can just expand, and okay, here it is. Okay, so let me basically hide this part. So let's emphasize on this part. Here, if you see, the book, when we are talking about the structure, there is again a structure for each task. Let me go back to BABOK and explain them what they mean. Okay, if you go to 3.1, if you see here 3.1.1, it talks about the purpose. What is the purpose of business analysis approach? Then it talks about 3.2, the description of the basically BA approach. Then the 3.1.3 is input. That's the input here are business the needs. Okay, then there is a diagram basically in every task, and then we try to see here elements 3.1.4. Within these elements, it talks about what are the key factors you need to consider, or you need to use them in order to complete the task. That's a planning approach. What is a planning approach is there, and what are the formality and the level of details the business analysis deliverables. And then it talks about basically, if you see, the difference between the predictive adaptive approach. It could be traditional, predictive may be called as a also plan driven and change driven, that was mentioned in the previous version, that's version number 2 in BABOK. And you may also consider them as a traditional versus modern. Okay, and this is a difference has been listed here, and here it is business analysis activities. 4 is a timing for business analysis work. 5th element is complexity and risk. Okay, so these are the elements basically, and 6 is acceptance. In the 3.1.5, you can look at the guideline and tool. If you see them, you can see here. I'm going to basically show you both. Guideline and tool. If you see here, this is 3.1.5 is guideline and tool. And these are the guidelines they are mentioned. For example, BA performance assessment, business policies, expert judgment, methodologies and framework, and stakeholder engagement approach. So these are the basically key guidelines you can basically consider in order to complete your task. Then we talk about the 3.1.6, that's a technique. Here also it is 3.1.6, that's a technique here. Techniques. Okay, so what are the possible techniques you can use it to complete your task? One is could be brainstorming, business case, document analysis, estimations, and so on. Right, there are so many listed here. Then you see 3.1.7, that's a stakeholder here. 3.1.7 stakeholder. Okay, that's a domain, subject matter expert, project manager, regulator, sponsor. These are the possible stakeholders. Now it is 3.1.8, that's output. Here it is 3.1.8, that's output here. So what are the outputs are here? Okay, so every task is basically described in this framework. It means the 1 is purpose, 2 is description, 3 is input, 4 is element, 5 is guideline and tool, 6 is techniques, 7 is stakeholder, 8 is output. So whenever you see, again I have listed for you all to understand, even in the stakeholder engagement you will see the same. The ending with 1 is purpose, 2 is description. Okay, so this is the structure is repeated for every task. So what you can do is that you have basically mentioned here. So I have created the another tab here. This is a tab. What we can do is that here we have mentioned, yes, BA planning and monitoring. This is, we can just take it all around here. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So in this there is a BA approach. BA approach is here. Okay. So within that if you see, the first is purpose, second is description, 3 is input, and 4 is elements, 5th is basically guideline and tool, 6 is BA technique, 7 output. So you can basically, what you can do is that this part you can delete. So this is the way you can basically structure your information. For example, I can go back here, purpose. It is basically to define the appropriate method, right? So here it is, you can just simply write down to define appropriate method. Okay, so this is, I have done this part. Okay, now second we talk about the description. You may find a few points. I'm just going to list a few couple of them. Like for example, I just take here, business analysis approach should be, it should be what it is, aligned to overall goals of the change, like goals of change. Okay, so this is the one you can basically write this part, and then you can add as input. Here is a business need, I have already explained here. Okay, then you can go to the next one is, just don't worry about this diagram right now. Then you can say, okay, in the elements what you have is basically planning approach. Okay, here it is mentioned. The second one is basically formality and level of details. Okay, and what is the third one here, if you want to see here, BA activities. Then you have a timing of BA work. Okay, so this way. Okay, so now I'm going to not list remaining part, or maybe just two of them. Let me write down complexity and risk. Acceptance. I'm going to put the insert 1. So this will, here what we can do is basically put a number, so it will be easier for you to remember. Okay, so I'm just taking this part here, so to ensure that there. Okay, now in the guideline and tool, same thing we can add. For example, BA performance assessment, right? Here it is. Assessment. Okay, so like that, they have like a business policies. Okay, so expert judgment, for example, like that. So in the technique, you can add them later on. In the BA technique, if you see, brainstorming business cases, okay, like that. In the stakeholder, let's do that. a little bit. Who are the stakeholders here? Like domain subject matter expert. So I will just write down simple domain SME, project manager. Okay, like that. What is output here? You can just read them. Initially, of course, you will have to read a couple of times in order to understand. Identify BA approach and activities that will be performed across an initiative, including who will perform the activities. So now here it is, you got who will perform the activity or roles. Okay, that's one you identified. Like that, you have to read and basically extract the information. And the timing and sequencing of the work, you can write down timing and sequencing of the work, right? So you can basically create this and populate. So once you complete this one, then you can basically copy this table and go to the next one. And here this one is same, and instead of this part you can write down stakeholder engagement. Okay, so in this is actually 3.2. okay, so you can basically remove this data, just simply cover this and delete all of them. Okay, I'm trying to delete it. Okay, so let me just simply okay, so you can basically, if you want, you can later on add this tables. It's okay, don't worry about it, like that. And you can populate the data here. So simply you can basically keep creating this what we call a table for each of the tasks. I'm going to copy here. Okay, so you can basically populate the data here, the what is a purpose, description, inputs, and easy for you to refer. Once you complete one chapter, then you can go to the next chapter and next chapter, like that. So you can create a one tab for each chapter or each knowledge area. So in one glance you can see the whole task or whole the section is basically explained well. So this is how you can basically remember your information clearly, and it is well structured. The data will be well structured. In case if you need this fully populated the Excel sheet, please write to me, and that's my email ID is sandhya.jane@gmail.com. Let me spell that again. SANDHYA dot Jane, JANA @gmail.com. Although it is not pronounced as a Jane, but it is for everyone to understand this. Sandhya, just let me go here. SANDHYA dot JANE@gmail.com. Okay, so here you can write down, and we will basically send you the Excel sheet. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video. Bye.